Appalachia, a word that evokes a whole passel of reaction. Everything from the beauty of a mountaintop to trailer parks, drugs, and about everything in between. The Appalachian Mountains are indeed the oldest mountains in the world. They once towered 30,000 feet into the air. They stretch from eastern Canada through 14 states all the way to Louisiana. Folks who live in these mountains have faced an unending number of tragic and just plain odd happenings that cry out for the telling. Hello, I'm Larry Bentley, and I was born and raised in these very mountains by a family who themselves were born and raised and lived for generations in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Come with me and we'll take a look at some of the unending stories that come from within my beloved mountains. And we'll look through the eyes of an Appalachian at some outside the area as well. Welcome to Season 5 of Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend. Friends, I hope you're doing well today. Thank you so much for dropping by. In November of 1921, Clinton County, which is located in what is known as the Appalachian region of Ohio, though it sits more in along the foothills more than it does the mountains, was all worked up over what most folks would get worked up over, and that would be murder. Well, in fact, 3 murders. And wouldn't you know that there's a story to go along with them? Of course you did, or I wouldn't be sitting here. And this one leaves everybody that hears it still wondering exactly what the heck happened. All we have to go on is the facts collected by investigators and stuffed into a neat little banker box, and like they always do, and when cases like this happen. And I actually heard the story a long time ago, finally got around to looking at it. I found some supporting information in various news articles printed back in the day, and the case still has folks about Cuba, Ohio, talking about it, still yet today. So sit on down there, hold on tight, because I'm fixing to tell you about it right now. I reckon we need to start with Thomas Oliver Vandervoort, who was a fur buyer from Burtonville, Ohio. He had a good name as far as fair-dealing man about them parts. Now, if you live in the mountains, we all know our local fur buyer, or I reckon I should say knew our local fur buyer. Where I come from, it was Terry Joe Bryson. He was our fur buyer for years. Now, I reckon the industry got so hard to deal with that old Terry Joe finally had to just give it up. I think he's retired from his general store altogether nowadays and just living on Uncle Sam maybe, or his savings, whatever. But, Terry Joe takes it easy right nowadays, I imagine. Anyway, it was a pretty chilly November night in 1921. When we all know in November, when the mountain air starts moving, it gets a good bit cool in them foothills too. It was Saturday, the 19th, and the moon was waning after it being a full beaver moon just a few days earlier. So that's when fur buyer Thomas was headed over to Miss Whitlow's house, not far from Cuba. Now, he didn't have to worry about the Castro goon squad snatching him up off the street, taking him to Havana and standing him up against the wall and pumping him full of lead because, again, he was in Cuba, Ohio. Now, Fur, as he walked along minding his own business, like we all do when something that you least expect happens, wouldn't you know it? That's when he saw a commotion. There was a good reason that he couldn't just ignore it and keep walking. And that commotion was at the very house that he was headed to, and was the house where his ex-wife Bertha and her mama, Miss Whitlow, both lived. He said that he saw a man bust out the front door of the Whitlow place, stepping and bitching like his head was on fire and his rear end was catching as he ran off down the road into the dark about as fast as Thomas could think to even focus his eyes on him. So, being that he did have family living there, he steps up on the place and takes a peek in the door, and what does he find? That's when he said he stumbled on a sight that would make a man's hair turn white. The place looked like Satan had showed up and done his trick shooting impersonation where they shoot the apple off folks' head, and of course Satan did what he always does. He shot a little low and left a big mess all over the inside the place. His ex-wife Bertha and a man named Howard Bozier were both stretched out on the floor, dead on the doornail, like a couple of them mounted bearskin rugs that you see, with so many holes in them that you could read a newspaper through them. Miss Whitlow, she was laying in the kitchen, all wounded up, mad as an old wet hen over it. Of course, Thomas was tore up from the floor up. He didn't know what to do except to call for Sheriff Kirk, who come a-running like he was being chased by the meanest man in the world. The sheriff rolled up and found Thomas standing there looking like he'd just seen his own ghost walk across his own grave. So Thomas started complaining and tells the sheriff that some feller took off out the door after he just happened to be walking by and heard a ruckus in the house. Thomas's 10-year-old boy who was living there with his mama, had been the one to go get the doctor. Doc Basinger stepped in and did a preliminary head-to-toe survey of poor Miss Whitlow because the other two were obviously beyond anything but maybe divine intervention. He saw that Miss Whitlow was in bad shape. She needed to get to the hospital 30 minutes ago. So he dragged her out to the ambulance, which was very likely a hearse from the local funeral home, doubling as an ambulance because folks across the country outside the big cities were just now beginning to understand the importance of having something full-time, that was committed to first aid and, an ambulance service. Now, I would imagine that if I'd been shot and somebody was dragging me out to a hearse, I'd be thinking, hold up just a minute. Ain't no need in rushing things. I believe I'm still kicking and I don't need an undertaker yet. But that's just me. Once he chunked Miss Whitlow into the back and got the door shut, they headed over to Gosson Basinger Hospital in Blanchester. The sheriff stayed behind to poke around the scene some, like the police are supposed to do. So he didn't hear a word of what came next over at the hospital, which was what Miss Whitlow had to say once she got there and once the doctor tallied up the wounds that she had and told her that there wasn't any way in the world she was going to recover and that it wasn't going to be too much longer before she was going to take that stroll through the valley that they talk about in the 23rd Psalm of the Holy Bible. Now, the woman was already mad enough from being all shut up to start with, alone having news like that thrown up in her big lap like a big white Persian cat. That's when she decided to do a little speaking on the whole story of how she ended up with holes punched in her. Once she was done talking, her story left a small issue with Thomas's story about how he was just moseying by his ex-mother-in-law's house, which was where his ex-wife lived, and just happened to see evil befall three people who were inside, and one of them being his ex-wife, who happened to be talking to a man who caught his share of the slugs too. The problem with all of that was that, well, he didn't know Miss Whitlow, with one of her feet in the grave, firmly planted down in there, would go on ahead and spill the beans as to what happened and who it was that busted through the door and wired the place all up. She said that it was Thomas, and it probably came along with something along the lines of, I told Bertha that he was a no-good half-wit, and then she needed to stay away from him. But no, she had to go marry. She was probably right in the middle of that dissertation of I told you so when her lights went out. Who knows, maybe the doctor might have been trying to pull a sheet over her head, before she was finished talking. I don't know. Then lo and behold, while all of that was going on, because they hadn't went ahead and arrested Thomas on the spot, I reckon because his story was feasible at the time, there was another shooting, this time over at Wilmington. Thomas, once he had witnessed wounds all over the front, back, both arms, chest, neck, and head of three different people, two of which were ex-family members, decided that he needed him a drink or 12 to calm his nerves. Of course, alcohol caused him to have a bit of an edge to his speeching once he had got into a debate with his good friend Rodney Wallace. That was enhanced by the continued consumption of the fire and water by both parties. It apparently got a little more heated as it went. Then about the time that Thomas went on ahead and planted a slug in Rodney's shoulder for him because he just so happened to be holding a gun at the time. Rodney lived, of course, but if anybody believed Thomas's story about what happened in the Whitlow house, they sure as heck didn't believe it anymore. And that left Thomas in a whole heap of trouble. It left Sheriff Kirk no choice but to go find a piece of dog squeeze, pounce on, arrest, and drag him downtown with 3 counts of murder hanging over his head, along with 1 attempted murder. And, like an avalanche of rocks ready to fall on him at any minute. Now, when Thomas had his arraignment in court, like you do when you're charged all up with murder, he looked like he hadn't seen the sun since 1901. He was so pale that he looked like a cave-grown albino lizard. He pleaded not guilty, I reckon because his story was his story and he was sticking to it. So that left the whole proceeding to wait for a fancy lawyer to come from New York City to try to help him out. W.B. Rogers was the feller that was supposed to be the best mouthpiece that money could buy. And from what we know so far, the old boy probably had his work cut out for him. The trial was set for Friday, January 28th, 1922. And that courtroom was so packed that you couldn't have shot a fly into it with a cannon. The doctor who'd seen the bodies was first up, and he told the judge and the jury what he'd found. Then he pulled a Perry Mason and dropped the bomb about Miss Whitlow and what she said about Thomas's gunplay episode and everything that went with it. Before she exited the big play, stage left. Thomas's lawyer, Mr. Rogers, he was sure enough a silver-tongued individual, and he went about spinning some fable about Thomas being a lovesick fool, not a cold-blooded killer. I reckon if you're a lovesick fool, you're a warm-blooded killer, but I don't know if that makes any difference to the one he's accused of killing or not. That's just me. Then Mr. Rogers, suddenly using the voice of Mr. Rogers from the neighborhood, talked about how Thomas, kindness to his mother as he was, had just bought furs and was just trying to do right by his family. Then he went on explaining how Thomas was drugged and had been out of his mind when all the gunplay happened. So I guess he had that going for him, Thomas did. I'd be wondering why at the amount of fur money that I paid that dude, he was kind of acting like I might have done it, what with all the excuses and all. Then the prosecutor, A.L. Gregory, got his turn, and he wasn't letting Thomas off easy. He had witnesses lined up out the door and evidence, enough evidence, I guess, to make it look like Thomas had been out for hide of his ex-wife and married Mr. Bossier instead of any old flea-bitten fur that night. And the jury, well, they had a real tough time with it. Two of them were the first females to ever sit on a murder trial in Clinton County. They knew they had to get it right, of course, and it was a pretty heavy burden for anybody to bear, let alone having the eyes of the country focused on the fact that women were on the jury, because back then, and it's downright stupid to think now, but popular opinion was that women were driven by pure emotion and couldn't overcome that to make a clear-headed decision on much of anything. Now, the whole jury was probably pissed that Thomas's lawyer talked to him like Fred Rogers did the kids on PBS. Anyway, the days dragged on like a wagon with a broken wheel, and folks sat around the courtroom trying to decide what to do with Thomas, and folks were holed up and listening to all sorts of tales and evidence that they'd come across, trying to figure out if Thomas had lost his mind over love or if he was just plain evil. Now, the defense had played the sob story, saying Thomas had been drugged and didn't know what he was doing, while the prosecution had its own story, with witnesses swearing they saw Thomas with a gun, and a look in his eye that he knew exactly what he was fixing to do, and he'd dance around the room while he did do it, we believe. Finally, the day came when the jury had to make up their minds, because they can't stay in the room and argue from now on. Whoever the announcer was for the court stepped out like Gene Rayburn on Match Game and announced that there was a verdict. And you could have heard the floorboards creaking when the jury filed in, and you could hear the pin drop all over the courtroom when they sat down. The judge looked at them and looked at Thomas and then asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreman stood up and said they had, and you could see the sweat pouring down Thomas's face just before they spoke guilty. And then you could have heard a ghost fart. The trial cost the county dang near more than it had to spend on anything, and it was the talk of the town for years. It even made it into the big city newspapers like Chicago Tribune and the New York Times. Those two ladies on the jury, Mrs. Hall and Mrs. Woodmancy, they said they'd earned their spot on that jury and did what they thought was right. It was a big deal for them to be there and go back in that day, and yes, I think they did do exactly what was right. Judge Clevenger, well, he had no love to give Thomas, and that came with a complete lack of mercy. He sentenced Thomas to the Ohio State Penitentiary for the remainder of his natural life, saying maybe after a few years, if he held his mouth just right and kept his nose real clean, he might just have a shot at parole someday. But for now, he was going away, and he'd have plenty of time to think about what he'd done. With that, the courtroom erupted like a pressure cooker still on the boil, with people screaming, yelling, and crying. It was a sad day for a good number of folks in Clinton County, and they wasn't leaving that place feeling good about it because they actually liked Thomas. They just didn't know what drove him to kill the very folks that were supposed to be his family. The whole ordeal had folks talking to this day, folks, and some said that Thomas got what was coming to him, and others swore up and down that he was innocent. But in the end, it was the law that done the talking, and Thomas Oliver Vandervoort was a man who'd never walk free again. Yes, there was some appeals filed, but they failed. I couldn't find a bit of information as to whether or not he ever tried for or got parole. I can tell you that if he did, he didn't. He wound up staying in prison. If I had to guess, it was because he had himself convinced that he didn't do it, or maybe he truly didn't do it, for all I know. Back then, you had to at least admit your guilt and show some remorse in order for be considered for parole. I can tell you that because all of that, because he did die in an Ohio prison. Now, they didn't even record the prison or the date of his death. Heck, nobody even bothered to write down where they planted him. If they did, I guess they plain sure chunked the paperwork and the whole thing in the grave with him and just covered it all up. Now, the town of Cuba, Ohio would never forget that November night or the name Thomas Oliver Vandervoort. His name would be scribbled in their history books right alongside the word murderer. And that was all she wrote. Hope you got something out of our story today. If you did, please rate and review the podcast. And don't forget to subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, Rumble, or Spotify. Throw us a like. And don't forget to subscribe, and like I said, and follow wherever you're listening or watching. Come on over to Appalachian Murder Mystery or Legend podcast group on Facebook, where we talk Appalachian or about anything else you want to talk about. I'll be back real soon with another Appalachian Murder Mystery or Legend, and I will see you then.